Well, good morning. It is so great that you can be with us as we start our brand new series called Everybody Always. You know, over the past 12 months, for me, and maybe you can relate to a lot of these things that we've been experiencing, things like self care, things about healthy eating, or in my situation, maybe it's not so healthy eating, exercise regimes, and figuring out new ways in how to keep fit, creating these WFH spaces. You know, WFH? Yeah, working from home, creating these functional spaces at home if you've been doing that as well. So much of the year has been to preserve life almost in the me space, in the my space, and rightly so, yeah. I don't know about you, but this series is going to be almost not looking inward, but looking outward. We're going to be looking out and being challenged in how we can love everybody always. That's what it's focused on. You know what, we can see a light at the end of the tunnel in our current situation, but you know what, we want to bring to light God's love for everybody, and we want to do that all the time. Bob Goff wrote the book, Everybody Always. We're going to be exploring what it means to love people like Jesus does, without limits or regard for comfort. So, without limits, when I think about how we love people like Jesus does, that's not always easy, is it? That's not always easy. Sometimes we'll be tempted to maybe put excuses up and for reasons why we were not going to go out and do that. Some of us might even want to play the COVID card at the moment to say, you know what, or because of restrictions, well, I can't love the way that I used to love, or I can't do those things because it's just not normal. But you know what, over these next sort of 5 weeks, I want to really encourage you and to think about creative ways in how you can love people, even in our current situation. And as we move forward into the rest of the year, when things open up and we can start to do even more. But you know what? It shouldn't hold us back in loving people who are around us. Loving people like Jesus does as well has no regard for our comfort. In fact, it's going to be really uncomfortable. But don't let that put you off. Stick around with us. It's going to be a great time over the next 5 weeks as we dig even deeper to give you ways in which you can love. We're going to share loads of different stories. And you know what? I believe you're going to be blessed if you come along the journey with us. And you know what? I believe Jesus deserves our best, doesn't he? Even when it might feel awkward, it might be out of our way, it might be even inconvenient. But you know what? Doesn't the Christian life require that of us sometimes? I think it really does. We want to explore 3 themes for the Christian life. And the first one is this: knowing who we are. Knowing who we are in Christ, a really great foundational place to start. Then knowing what we must do. Because all very well knowing who we are, but actually knowing what we must do is key. But the last thing, the third thing, is even more important, and it's knowing how to do it. All the first 2 are great, but if you don't do it, then it's actually worth nothing at all. We have to put those things into practice. We need to go in, we need to do the things in our life to make a difference and to love. Love causes us to action, right? Love causes us to do something. So through reading the book, I hope you can buy the book and get that in your hand and start reading it. I've been listening to the audio version on Audible, on the Audible app. So I'm listening to it as I'm driving my car. Great way to listen to the book. Listen to Bob on Sundays. He's going to share in just a few minutes' time and share some great stories and just really unpack this topic even more. And obviously we're going to be unpacking some of these themes in our life groups as well. And I know you're going to be blessed and find new ways to love. Bob Goff says in his book, he says this. He says, the reader is shown the culture-conquering and Christ-exalting power of the gospel. For when joy is a habit, love is a reflex. I want to say that again. I think that's fascinating. When joy is a habit, love is a reflex. I think that's incredible. It kind of brings to mind that verse how in the Bible where the joy of the Lord is my strength. The more that I have joy in the Lord, the more that I am joyful, the more that I can then show love. It's just a reflex. It's something I just naturally do no matter where I go, no matter what I'm doing. Love is that thing that I am doing. Rooted in the Old Testament through Deuteronomy and Leviticus, we see 2 passages, in fact, that kind of center us around our purpose as Christ followers. We see it go through into the New Testament, all through the Gospels. And I want to pick up these verses in Luke chapter 10 and verse 25, and it says this. It says, on one occasion, an expert of the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Well, what is written in the law, he replied. How do you read it? And so he answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. A great verse if you've been a Christian for any time, and one that you probably would have known really, really well. But you know what? I find it so interesting because there's this one tiny little word right in the middle, which is such a powerful thing that I really want to highlight today. In fact, in this current season, I'm actually homeschooling my 6-year-old son. And it's a bit of an interesting time, let's just say that. I'm not the one who's the most patient person, and that's really come to light at the moment. I don't know about teaching just one child, let alone 30, but all I could say is teachers out there, if I had a hat, I would literally take it off to you right now. You guys are absolutely incredible. How about you might even post that in the chat? You know, teachers are awesome, aren't they? Teachers are so awesome because I don't know how you do it, but it's great. You know what? There's a reason why I didn't learn to be a teacher, and that's why I'm going to pass that back to you hopefully very soon. At the moment, though, we're learning in our with my son Zach all about conjunctions, how we can sort of grow sentences and how we can sort of put this sentence and this sentence, put them together, and usually it's by one little word in the middle. And a conjunction can be anything from for or and or nor or but or yet or so, and that's how we can grow them. Sometimes I kind of read through the passages and all these conjunctions that are sort of coming out to me now as we've been learning this. But I would love for the command to maybe read like this: to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, or love your neighbor as yourself. Wouldn't that be easier if you just put an or instead of an and, that we could actually choose by the one command or the other? And actually, if you had a choice between one, to love God or love others, wouldn't we maybe just choose the easier option, like just to love God? Because obviously, yeah, it's between me and God. And although that takes work, it takes a daily relationship with Him, but surely that's easier than having to love all the people around us, all the people that we come into contact, all the difficult people that come into our life. Surely that would just be the easier option. But it doesn't say or, it says and. It says and actually it says not just one, not just two commands that are connected by the and, but actually I believe it's one whole command. That Jesus would, when it was written, it would say, love the Lord your God, and he kind of think, how can I grow that sentence? I'm going to put and to love your neighbor, and it's this whole command all in one. The end of the verse actually says this, it says, you've answered correctly, Jesus replied, and he says, do this and you will live. I don't know about you today, but I want to live. I have a study Bible at home, and whenever I sort of prep for these days, I want to dig a bit deeper, and I read the commentary on some of these verses. And I want to read to you just on a couple of these. It says, love for God and neighbor is built on the love that the Lord has for his people and on his identification with them. Such love is to be total. Remember that word, total, involving one's whole being. One should place no limitations upon the love for the neighbor, but instead a person should love to do an abundance of good for his fellow being as he does for himself. And he even goes one step further and says the word neighbor does not merely mean the one who lives nearby, but anyone with whom one comes in contact. Wow. Isn't that fascinating? And I love how it says that, how it has to be total, it has to be involving one's whole being. It's not just two commands, it's one command. It's one great command. And with all the passages in the Bible that reference this command, its significance is total devotion. And you know what? It's not just commanded. I believe it's demanded upon all of us who call us Christ followers today. You know, there's a few people in my life who I admire, and way they're up on my list is my dad. I love my dad. And he's actually stepped into retirement this year after working for so many years. He was in the lighting business, so he had a lighting company, sold lights in all of its forms. And so he was naturally a great salesperson. And being a salesman, you are naturally a relational person. You get on really well with other people, and that's something I really admire about him. But you see, going into a supermarket and buying some groceries seemed to be quite an event as I was sort of growing up. And we'll get all that groceries and we'll put it up onto the conveyor belt and we'll kind of go down to the checkout guy or gal, and we would and they would just give us that sort of generic, mundane sort of a script that they have, which is just simply, hi, how are you? And my dad would say, well, Sally, my day's fantastic. How was yours? And he would literally call them by name, and they'd sort of just be shocked in his enthusiasm, just because not many people were like that. And he had this conversation, and he would tell some jokes, and they would laugh, and he had a lot of good dad jokes as well. And there was this whole exchange that happened, and I was always just inspired by how he sort of lit up this person's life just by simply calling him by name, doing something a little bit different, and just loving them in a way that was just like that. Nowadays, whenever I go to the supermarket with my wife and my kids, I seem to mimic some of those characteristics from my dad. And I say things in maybe a bit different way, maybe have a bit more enthusiasm. And my wife sort of rolls her eyes in embarrassment quite often now. But isn't it quite interesting that you can't start to mimic those people who you admire? You start doing the things that they were doing because actually you liked those things and you want to do them as well. The more time you spend with those people, the more that you actually do similar things. You know, our Heavenly Father's the same. You know, when we look at Jesus in the Bible, you know, I admire Jesus and all the things that he has shown. I don't know about you. But you know what? He shows time and time again how he can love people all the time. And if I can know and understand and get around the word and get around people more like that, maybe I can express that. Maybe I can do similar things and mimic those things so that I can change and maybe help someone be just a bit more loved in my world. Maybe Jesus could do something in their life if I could start to love them just the way he would have loved them. You know, when I think about it, I think about how when someone gets called by their name, something how powerful that is. And when you call someone by name, even like at a checkout, you know, I'm actually fascinated by that. In fact, when I was growing up, I actually didn't realize, how did my dad actually know their name? I didn't actually know how they knew. And as I was kind of growing up, I realized that most people had a name badge on, and that's how he sort of figured it out in the end. But calling someone by name is fascinating because behind every name badge is a person, and behind every person is a story. And you know what? God loves every person and every story. And if he does, you know what? Then we should love every person. We should want to know what people's stories are as well. There's a story in the Bible that we kind of see how Jesus called actually someone else by name, and that's the story of Zacchaeus. A great, well-known story, and the story of Zacchaeus really just goes by this man that was a tax collector. Wasn't a very well-favored person, or a person who people just didn't like really. He would take some the tax from people, maybe pocket some from himself, give some to where it should be. But one day, Jesus was coming through his town. Jesus was doing miracles, he was telling parables, and he had like this hordes of people around him at any one time. Zacchaeus wanted to go and see Jesus, even meet Jesus, but everyone was around and he couldn't see. The reason why he couldn't see Jesus was because, as we know, he's quite a short man. So what did he do? He had to think creatively of, how do I go about to see Jesus? And he did what every other middle-aged man would do in those days, and he climbed a tree. He climbed a sycamore tree, as we know the story, to go and see Jesus. Jesus then comes along to the very position where Zacchaeus was. And what does he do? He stops, he looks up, he says, Zacchaeus, calls him by name and says, come down immediately. I want to stay at your house. And he comes down and meets Jesus. What I find so fascinating about this story right up to this point is that Jesus is literally surrounded by so many people who are probably good people who probably loved people, who were probably high up in the community, people who were hanging off every word that Jesus was saying. But out of all these people, Jesus looked for the one. Jesus looked up and looked for the one who was unlovable, the one that people said who was the sinner, but aren't we all sinners? The person who people thought, oh, he's just no good. And Jesus singled that person out and said, Zacchaeus, come down. I want to stay at your house. What happens then, Zacchaeus has this sort of grand gesture and says, I want to pay back everything that I have taken. I'm going to give back 4 times as much as well. And you know what? Jesus said, you know what? Salvation has come to this house today. We don't really know if Jesus actually went to his house in the end, because he kind of moved on and told some parables. But it doesn't matter if he went to his house. All we know is that, do you know what? Zacchaeus' heart was changed. Why? Because Jesus spent time to look up. Jesus spent time to actually find the person, call them by name, and love them where they were. And you know what? His life was changed forever. Maybe there's a lesson there for you and me to maybe look up every now and then, to maybe find someone, call them by name, get to know them. And you know what? Maybe through the love that you're showing, maybe Jesus can do something in their life. And maybe one day, do you know what could happen? Salvation can come to their house. How incredible would that be? You know what? I'm going to hand over to Bob now, and he's going to continue this whole topic today of loving people where you are.
Hi everybody, it's Bob Goff here. I'm sitting on my back porch and I'm just so glad that we're going to get some time over the coming weeks to just talk about some stories, to talk about how we love one another. And we start with the people that are nearby, that are people that are in the blast radius of your love already. This series is called Everybody Always, and there's a book that goes along with it. But the most important thing I want you to know is that you're welcome here. There's something beautiful about just being welcomed. Plenty of us have been invited to things, right? Have you ever been invited somewhere you weren't welcome? There's a big difference. And so one of the things that I think that we can do in our lives is to let people know they're not just invited, they're actually welcome. And once people are welcome, they start sharing stories. And my hope is that we can just spend this next time together sharing a couple stories. And a win would be this, that after you're done watching this, you're sharing stories. Say, how has that happened to you? Where was a time that you saw somebody give away extravagant love? Who was your neighbor? We're going to talk first about a neighbor of mine. She's somebody that's taught me a tremendous amount about loving people. It was always a lawyer like me that tried to set up Jesus. Remember, he came up and said, tell me the big commandment. And Jesus said to love God with your heart and your soul and your mind. And he said, let me tell you another one, to love your neighbor like yourself. I learned a lot about loving your neighbor from a neighbor of mine who lived across the street. Sweet Maria and I had been married for a couple years and we bought our first house. And I was so excited about this house of ours. We did everything. It was actually pretty nasty. We lived in the driveway in a motorhome for almost a year because there was a bunch of feral cats running around. It was just nasty. They were everywhere, and they were evidently afraid of mice because there was mice everywhere too. So we finally decided to take a step down in our lifestyle and move into the home we owned. And we tried to make this home ours. And over the course of a year or two, we just nailed it. It was beautiful. It was the house of Maria's dreams. Well, I was having breakfast with a friend and I overheard the guy in the booth next to me talking to the person he was with about how he's going to sell his house. And it was right by my favorite surfing spot. The name of the surfing spot was Garbage. And so I slid into the booth next to him and said, man, I'm so sorry for eavesdropping, but it sounds like you're going to sell your house. I know your house. Is there any way you want to swap for mine? And I did one of those George Banks things. I threw in the china. We literally traded houses over waffles. Well, I got home. I told Sweet Maria what a terrific deal I'd done. I blindfolded her. I drove her over to our house and I took the blindfold off. And I was pointing at the house and back to my surf spot in the house, and she started crying. And she told me every marriage gets one of those. And I just used up 2 of those. Well, we stayed in that house for a couple years and she fixed it up, and she did what she does to everything else in my life. She takes my garbage and makes it beautiful. But then it was time to sell the house we had before. So we put a for sale sign in the lawn, and 5 people wanted to buy this thing. But we weren't looking for a buyer, we were looking for a neighbor. There's a big difference. You do business with buyers, you do life with your neighbors. And Carol came along. And Carol was a widow, and James in the book talks about widows and orphans and how we're supposed to treat them. So we gave her a big group hug and we said, Carol, you're our neighbor. And Carol moved in and lived there for the next 22 years. Carol became a famous family member, not just a family friend. As a matter of fact, our son and daughter-in-law got married in our backyard. And in the front row, there was a couple seats, and one was for Carol. When the kids were growing up, they used to run across the street to Carol's house. They'd tell her stories about how they would throw balls in the hall at each other, and they coined the phrase hall ball for this game they would play. They told her about how my other son got married to a life-size Barbie with my daughter officiating. They even told her about how my other son lost a frog in the living room. And every time when they tell Carol these stories, she'd put her hands over her mouth and act like it was the first time they told her, even though it was the 20th time. She'd ask him again, tell me about the frog that got away. And the whole time she would fill them with mountains of cookies. And we have a parade. We have this beautiful tradition on our block because we think this idea of loving your neighbors means you need to know them so that you can love them. So we started throwing a parade. We've had this parade for 22 years. It's been terrific. And Carol was the queen one year. You guys, it's great. When she goes to the grocery store, people bow to her and call her Your Majesty. It'll take her 45 minutes just to fill her tank up with gas. Everybody's interrupting her, saying, let me do that for you. It's really just beautiful. And I think there's something about loving our neighbors that was woven into the DNA. I know it's woven into our faith. It was so important that Jesus said that's where we'd start, not where we'd end. Carol and I talk to each other. We've been talking to each other on the cell phones for 20 years. And I just don't want her to be alone. And I think that's probably why God made so many people on earth, so nobody would have to be lonely for very long. And one day I called Carol, and she said she just got back from the doctor and she'd gotten some bad news. The doctor said, Carol, you have cancer. And so I rushed over to her house, but I stopped at Radio Shack first, and I got us 2 walkie-talkies. And I put the walkie-talkie in her bedroom. I put the other walkie-talkie in ours. And for the next couple of years, Carol and I started talking to each other on the walkie-talkie. There's something beautiful. It's kind of like stringing 2 peach cans together. Because when you're on a walkie-talkies, you're 9 years old. You're up in tree forts. Nobody's got cancer. The first time I called her up, I said, hello, Carol? You got to make the sound. She said, Bob, is that you? I'm like, who else would it be? And for the next couple of years, Carol and I only talked on the walkie-talkies. And you know what? These walkie-talkies didn't fix her cancer, but she wasn't afraid anymore. I think that's God's message to us. It's always been his message to us. He said it to Joshua. He said, you're taking over for Moses. And Joshua said, I can't do that. He said, Joshua, be not afraid. God said it to Abram before this big battle. He said, I'm your shield and your great reward. Be not afraid. Jesus said it to 4 dudes in a rowboat, and he came walking out on the water, and he said, it is I. Be not afraid. I think he knew that if we weren't afraid, then nobody would be afraid. It would spread like a cold, just the best kind of cold in the world. That we would see what he's doing in our lives, in the lives of the people he's surrounded us, and we'd get another peek at what he might be doing in the world. And we start with our neighbors. Well, Carol took a turn, and we ended up visiting her in the hospital after this operation, and I brought the walkie-talkie with me. And I gave it to the nurse and had her bring it to Carol. And I slipped into the bed in the other side of the room. And I had a walkie-talkie. And I turned it on after saying a prayer that God would allow Carol to just stay with us for a little bit longer. And when I turned it on, I said, hello, Carol? And you could hear a little fumbling around in the bed next door. And Carol said in a really weak voice, Bob, is that you? And I said, oh, Carol, it is. And we just cried and cried together. When my kids were really young, when they had trouble sleeping, what I'd do is I'd rub their nose, right here. And Carol and I talked about her life and We talked about Jesus and a life together, and I'd rub her nose until she would fall asleep. Carol had these really unique appetite, like things that would like sweep over her. And she decided she wanted this particular kind of hot dog. And I think they must only make 4 or 5 a year, because I drove around to every single deli in San Diego trying to find one. I finally found the hot dogs. I wanted to spike it in the aisle. I was like, yes, it was like finding Jimmy Hoffa. And I rushed home. I showed her the hot dog and she said, I want to see the package. She knows I'm a lawyer and I might go Oscar Mayer on her. That's what neighbors do. That's what we were meant to do. We were meant to find our joy, and part of our joy is helping other people find theirs. We brought Carol home to be among her friends and family for the last days that she'd spend with us here on earth. And I asked Carol, do you have kind of a bucket list thing, something you always wanted to do that you've just never gotten around to doing before? And she said, you know what? I've always wanted to toilet paper someone's house. And I'm like, oh, that's awesome. Well, the next day she called me at 4 p.m. and she's like, let's go. I'm like, girl, you usually go at midnight, but whatever. So we went across the street and we started throwing toilet paper over the neighbor's tree. And she had this thing. She's got quite an arm too. And just as we were getting the last roll over the top, the cops showed up. They turned on their lights. They said, this is a misdemeanor. I'm like, buddy, I have diplomatic immunity. She's dead in a week. Sue me. Well, that's what happens. You guys, you just want to find that childlike faith. Jesus spent a ton of time with his friends talking about that. 2 of his friends actually were arguing about who'd get the big chair next to him in heaven. And he said, I'll tell you the truth, unless you change and become like a child, you'll never enter the kingdom of God. I was raised, you just say a prayer. Evidently, there's more. It's a childlike faith. Not childish, guys. We've got that nailed. But a childlike faith. Think of that playfulness. Think of the younger version of you. What do you do when you lose the keys to your car? You go back and you say, where was the last place I saw them? Think to yourself, where was the last place I saw my joy? Where was the last place that I felt like this idea of curiosity, what was happening around me, who lived around me, who were my neighbors? We had one last New Year's Day parade, and my prayer was that Carol would make it long enough to see one last parade. And she was too weak to make it outside that day, and so we picked her up and we put her in the front window of her home. What Carol didn't know is we changed the parade route, and all 700 of us walked right through her front yard. And Carol sat in her chair, blowing kisses goodbye to her friends. And kids put their noses up against the windows and bounced balloons. And that next week, Carol went home to heaven. It would have been her second parade of the week. And you know what Carol taught me? She taught me the value of knowing your neighbors, and not just knowing about them or just waving to them, but diving into their lives. And because we did a cannonball into Carol's life, she did a cannonball into ours. And she taught us more about our faith. She taught us more about these beautiful ideas that Jesus shared with a lawyer: to love God with your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor like yourself. Here's the deal, you guys. Like, we want to love everybody on earth. Like this idea that God so loved the whole world. But what we need to do is start across the street. Find these people that God's already put in proximity to you, and then you be present with them. And I know it can be awkward. God makes us in every different flavor. But what he made for us is to understand more about him by understanding more about the neighbors that he put around us. And if we keep avoiding people, we'll never meet our neighbors, and we'll miss out on some of what God has. I meet people that don't want to be around other people. And I'm like, oh, you're going to hate heaven. Everybody, always, right? So start with your neighbors. Here's just a practical thing. You've got a neighborhood full of people. Go and meet people. I literally bring them a candy cane. Don't wait for Christmas. Like, drop them a note and say, I'm just grateful to be your neighbor. Find some way to connect. I've got a neighbor that for a dozen years took my garbage out every single Monday morning and he put it back. He's running this huge corporation, but he spent every single week taking my garbage out and putting it back. You know why? He knew what it meant to love your neighbor, and I think you do too. You're probably amongst a group of them now. You might be in different neighborhoods, but God sees this earth as one big neighborhood. So you don't have to, again, go across an ocean. My hope is that what you'll do is you'll listen to these things and then tell stories amongst yourselves about your neighbors and how you've engaged them. And you can't love them if you don't know them. So what's a big step for you? Who are you going to get to know? What's your next courageous move? And I'll tell you, it might be just next door, to this side, to that side, or across the street. Find them, and I tell you what, you'll find a little bit more about your faith. You'll find out more about who God is. You'll know more about who you are. And you know what else you'll know? You'll know who your neighbors are. Go across the street, find somebody, and take the next courageous step for you. And we aren't going to compare leaps because God doesn't do that. He isn't interested in what you do compared to what I do and the next person. But what he did is he planted these beautiful people around you. I hope you'll go and meet them because you'll find out more about who he is. You'll find out more about who you are when you find out more about who your neighbors are. All right, you guys, so long.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Wasn't that incredible? I love just hearing the stories that Bob was sharing about his friend Carol, and I hope you've been blessed by that as well. We can be so impactful in our lives if we are intentional with our love. And I love just some of those really great examples that Bob just shared, just by simply taking the rubbish out on rubbish day for your neighbors, or it might be simply just sending a text message or just calling someone you might not for some time, but thinking creatively, but calling someone by name. Let's put love into action this week. And Matt, I just want to challenge you with a couple of questions as well. But what does love look like in your life? It can be extravagant, or it can be simply just something really simple. Jesus asked us to start loving others by first loving our neighbors. So who are your neighbors? Are they the person literally just next door, or are they the person that you see at the supermarket, putting all of your groceries through? And what are some ways this week where you can actively love that person? We can actively love your neighbor. Just think about those things. We're going to be kicking back off next week again, so make sure you join with us over these next 5 weeks as we dig even deeper in how we can love everybody always. I want to just finish off with one quote from the book, Everybody Always, and Bob says this: "We don't need to cross the ocean to love people extravagantly. We just need to cross the street." So go do that. God bless.